"Today you are under my protection," the emperor said, and passion refused to let her go. No one without the appropriate title was allowed inside the great planetarium. However, for 17 days, Illyra Thorn worked alone within its chamber, touching the mechanism that controlled the Empire's time. It was a duty that required the skill of a clockmaker and the mind of an astronomer, a task for which she, a woman without title or land, possessed a unique, quiet talent. Her tools, cleaned and oiled, lay nestled in their velvet-lined case. The scent of mineral spirits and metal dust clung to her plain woolen dress. Outside the narrow slit-like windows of the orrery chamber, the sunstone citadel sprawled. A city of golden stone and political gravity she had been permitted to enter, but never to truly inhabit. She was a technician, a temporary cog in the vast impersonal machinery of the state. Now, her function fulfilled, she was ready to become invisible again. Her departure required a single signature on a travel warrant, a formality to be completed in the Hall of Petitions. Illyra walked the cavernous corridors, her footsteps a small, solitary sound against the marble. The air grew warmer, thicker, laden with the smells of beeswax, ink, and the faint, cloying perfume of courtiers. Here, power was not measured in the precise swing of a pendulum, but in proximity to the throne, in the subtle hierarchies of posture and gaze. The Hall of Petitions was a theater of controlled desperation. Sunlight, fractured by stained glass windows depicting the founding myths of the Athelian Empire, speared through the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing over supplicants and officials. Illyra felt the familiar shrinking of her own presence, the instinct to fold into herself that came with being in the presence of the titled and the powerful. She was a sparrow in an aviary of eagles. She approached a scribe's rostrum at the far end of the hall, a bastion of ink-stained oak and stacked parchments. The man there, Scribe Theron, did not look up. He was old, his face a roadmap of bureaucratic fatigue. "Name and purpose," he intoned, his quill scratching across a ledger. "Illyra Thorn, chronographer. My duties are complete. I require a release of my travel warrant." Her voice was steady, practiced in its neutrality. Theron's finger traced a line down a long list. Thorn. Yes, the orrery calibration. He pulled a fresh document from a pile, dipped his quill, and began to write, his movements slow and deliberate. For him, she was a name on a list, an entry to be closed. That was all she wanted to be. The freedom of anonymity was the only freedom she had ever known. He was halfway through signing his name when a change occurred in the hall. It was not a sound, but the sudden absence of it. The low murmur of 100 conversations, the rustle of silk and paper, the scrape of a petitioner's knee on the stone floor, all of it ceased. Into that vacuum of sound stepped a presence. Illyra looked up, following the terrified gaze of the scribe. The guards at the grand entrance had not moved, but the air itself seemed to part before the man who walked through it. Emperor Kadric moved with a preternatural stillness, as if the space around him was a denser medium that only he could navigate without effort. He was not a large man, nor was he adorned in the ostentatious jewels of his courtiers. He wore a tunic of dark, unembellished wool, the color of a starless night sky. Power was not in his clothes, but in the absolute certainty of his carriage, in the way every eye in the hall fixed upon him, a constellation of lesser bodies orbiting a central sun. His face was a study in control, all sharp planes and shadows, his expression unreadable. He did not look at the crowd, he simply moved through it, and it yielded. His path, impossibly, was directed toward her. Scribe Theron's hand froze over the parchment, a droplet of ink swelling at the tip of his quill. Elira felt a prickle of cold dread. She had been meticulous, invisible. She had spoken to no one but the master artisan who had provided her tools. She had done nothing wrong. In the Empire, that was often not enough. The Emperor stopped, not before the scribe, but before her. The distance was a mere 5 feet, a chasm of status and authority. The entire hall held its breath, a collective witness to this inexplicable focus of the Absolute. His eyes, the color of winter frost, met hers. They were not cruel. They were something far more unnerving, analytical. He was not looking at a woman. He was examining a component, assessing its properties. "The chronographer," he said. His voice was not loud, yet it filled the hall, a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the stone. Elira Thorne. He knew her name. The simple fact sent a tremor through her. "Your Majesty," she managed, her voice a thin thread. She dipped into the prescribed curtsy, her body moving with the ingrained deference of the powerless. When she rose, he had not moved. His gaze was still locked on her. "Your work is satisfactory." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact he had somehow already verified. "I am glad it meets with the Empire's approval, Your Majesty." "It does," he said. He glanced at the half-signed warrant on the scribe's desk. The drop of ink finally fell, spattering the document like a black tear. "Your travel warrant is denied." The words were spoken calmly, with no more inflection than his previous statement. But in the silent watching hall, they landed with the force of a physical blow. Elira's mind, a place of logic and sequence, stalled. Denied? On what grounds? There was no procedure for this. Her contract was fulfilled. The law was clear. She opened her mouth to object, to ask the question that burned on her tongue. Why? But he spoke again, his voice cutting through her nascent protest. He addressed not just her, but the entire listening room. The words were precise, public, and irrevocable. "You are under my protection today." A ripple of shock went through the assembled courtiers. It was a subtle thing, a flicker of an eyelid here, a tightening of a jaw there. But Elira, an observer by nature, saw it all. Protection was a word with many meanings in the capital. It could mean safety, it could mean surveillance, it could mean possession. To be singled out for imperial protection was to be marked, to be lifted from the common current and placed into a new, dangerous stream. It was an honor that could kill. Her mind screamed, "Object, formally. Cite the Imperial Code, Article 4, Section 2. Freedom of movement for contract fulfillment. Do not let this happen." Her life, her small, self-contained world, was built on the foundation of her autonomy. It was her only true possession. To lose it was to lose everything. She drew a breath to speak, to reclaim herself. And then it happened. As his gaze remained on her, unwavering and absolute, something ignited deep within her. It was not fear. Fear was a cold, sharp thing she understood. This was a wave of heat that started in her belly and washed up through her chest, stealing the air from her lungs. It was a dizzying, terrifying pull, a resonance with the sheer force of his will. For one blinding moment, the Emperor was not a political entity, not a distant authority, but a man whose entire immense being was focused solely on her. The intensity of that focus was a physical pressure, a touch without contact. It was a power so profound it bypassed her reason, her principles, her very sense of self. Passion. The word bloomed in her mind, alien and shocking. It was not a gentle warmth, but a wildfire, consuming all her carefully constructed defenses. It was a desire not to be possessed by him, but to stand in the heart of that fire, to meet that staggering force with her own. The objection died in her throat. The articles of the Imperial Code turned to ash in her memory. Her body, which should have recoiled, felt rooted to the marble floor. Her silence was no longer the stunned pause of a victim. It was a choice, a surrender to a force she had not known existed within her. Emperor Kadric's eyes held hers for a beat longer. A flicker of something, not triumph, but confirmation, passed through their icy depths. He had seen it. He had seen her choice before she had even fully understood it herself. He turned away without another word. "Lord Marshal," he said to the air, and a man in the polished black armor of the Imperial Guard stepped out of the crowd. "See that Mistress Thorn is given quarters in the East Wing. She is not to be disturbed." The command was absolute. The Lord Marshal bowed. "Your Majesty." The Emperor walked on, the sea of courtiers parting before him and closing in his wake, the murmur of the hall slowly, cautiously returning. But the silence around Elira remained. She was an island now, the scribal desk her shore, the ruined travel warrant her flag. Scribe Theron stared at her, his face a mixture of awe and terror. She was no longer a name on his list. She was a piece on the Emperor's board. Elira did not look at him. She looked at the great doors through which the Emperor had departed. The fire in her chest had not subsided. It burned with a steady, terrifying heat. She had been summoned to the capital to fix a machine of brass and iron. She had done her duty and was supposed to go home. But the Emperor had said, "You are under my protection today." And passion, a force more powerful and less predictable than any law or logic she had ever known, would not let her leave. The quarters in the East Wing were a cage of exquisite comfort. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting serene pastoral landscapes, a cruel mockery of the simple countryside she could no longer reach. A fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth failing to penetrate the chill that had settled deep in her bones. A servant girl, no older than 15 and paralyzed with fear, had brought her a meal she hadn't touched and a change of clothes, a gown of deep blue silk that felt alien against her skin. It was a costume for a role she did not know how to play. For hours, Elira stood at the window which overlooked a private walled garden. The geometry of the hedges was perfect, the gravel paths raked into immaculate patterns. It was a beautiful, sterile space, a reflection of the palace itself. Order imposed upon nature, control. Her mind, finally released from the paralysis that had seized it in the Hall of Petitions, worked furiously. She replayed the Emperor's words, the reaction of the court, the sudden, shocking surge of her own emotions. The last part was the most terrifying. She was a creature of reason. Her life was a fortress built of logic and precision. That fortress had been breached, not by force, but by a willing, inexplicable internal collapse. She was under his protection. Why? The question echoed in the silent room. It was not random. A man like Kadric did nothing without purpose. His every action was a move in a game she could not see. He had called her the chronographer. He knew of her work. Had she, in the course of her duties, stumbled upon something? Her mind flew back to the orrery, to the faint, almost imperceptible anomaly she had discovered in the secondary tidal chronometer, a device that supposedly tracked lunar cycles but was also rumored to be a fail-safe for the Empire's encrypted long-distance communications. She had found a discrepancy, a series of minute, irregular accelerations in the mechanism's cycle, too patterned to be accidental wear. They were a message hidden in the ticks of a clock. She had noted it in her final report, as was her duty, under the heading Anomalous Mechanical Variance Requiring Further Diagnostic. She had assumed it would be reviewed by a senior artisan. She had not imagined it would reach the Emperor himself. That report made her a liability. Someone had been using the Empire's own clockwork heart to pass secret messages. That someone would not want the person who found the key to their cipher to simply walk away. So, the Emperor's protection was real. It was a shield, but a shield could also be a wall. He was not protecting her for her own sake. He was preserving an asset, a tool, and the passion that had kept her from objecting. That was her own weakness, a flaw in her own mechanism that he had seen and perhaps even counted on. The thought was galling. It stripped the strange, powerful moment of its mystery and left only the cold reality of manipulation. She was not a woman who had experienced a profound emotional cataclysm. She was a fool who had been momentarily mesmerized by power. The click of a key in the lock startled her. The door opened, not with the hesitant deference of a servant, but with a solid, confident motion. The Lord Marshal stood on the threshold, his black armor seeming to drink the light from the corridor behind him. His face was impassive, scarred by old battles. He was the Emperor's will made manifest. "Mistress Thorne, the Emperor will see you now." There was no "please." There was no "if you are ready." It was a summons. The cage door was opening, but only to lead her deeper into the maze. She smoothed down the unfamiliar silk of the gown. Her hands were steady. The shock had passed, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. She had made a mistake in the hall, a mistake born of an emotion she would not allow herself to indulge again. She had surrendered the first move. She would not surrender the next. "I am ready," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil within. She followed the Lord Marshal through a labyrinth of corridors, each more opulent and silent than the last. They passed no one. The palace seemed to hold its breath around them. They ascended a spiral staircase, the only sound the rhythmic clink of the Marshal's armor and the soft whisper of her silk slippers on the stone. They arrived at a set of double doors carved from dark, almost black wood. The guards outside did not challenge the Lord Marshal. They simply opened the doors, revealing the Emperor's private study. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the palace. There was no gold leaf, no ostentatious art. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with books and scrolls, their spines a somber tapestry of leather and vellum. The air smelled of old paper, wood smoke, and the sharp, clean scent of ink. A massive desk, carved from a single piece of petrified weirwood, dominated the space. Behind it, maps of the Empire were pinned to the wall, marked with black and red indicators. This was not a room for leisure. It was a command center. The brain of the Athelian state. Emperor Cadric stood not behind the desk, but by the large, unadorned window, looking out over the sprawling capital as night fell. The city lights were just beginning to glitter, a mirror of the stars above. He did not turn as she entered. The Lord Marshal closed the doors behind her, the sound of the latch clicking into place unnervingly final. She was alone with him. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence was a weapon, designed to unnerve, to force her to speak first, to reveal her position. She refused to take the bait. She stood where the marshal had left her, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her posture calm. She would not be the first to break. Finally, he turned from the window. The low light of the lamps cast his face in shadow, making his eyes seem darker, more profound. "You have a disciplined mind, Mistress Thorn," he said, his voice quiet. "You discovered an irregularity that 3 master artisans before you missed. You documented it with precision, and you did not speak of it to anyone." "I followed the protocol for my station," she replied, her tone even. "The report was for my superiors, not for public discourse. A commendable and rare adherence to procedure." He took a step toward her, closing the distance slightly. "Do you understand what you found?" "I found a mechanical anomaly," she stated, deliberately obtuse. "My expertise is in chronography, not cryptography." A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "Do not be coy. It does not suit you. You are intelligent enough to know that such patterns are not accidental. You found a channel of communication, a conspiracy flowering in the very heart of my government." He paused, watching her, gauging her reaction. She kept her face a placid mask. "The men responsible for that conspiracy," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "do not value adherence to procedure. If you had left the palace today, you would not have reached the city gates. Your death would have been noted as a tragic accident, a carriage mishap, a footpad in a dark alley. It would have been tidy, and you would be gone. Here it was, the justification, the articulation of the rules, the danger laid bare. "And so you placed me under your protection," she said, her voice still level, though a cold knot was tightening in her stomach. "You made a public spectacle of it. You painted a target on my back for the entire court to see." "A target, yes," he conceded, taking another step closer. They were now separated by only a few feet of empty space. "But a target standing beside the most powerful man in the empire is the safest target in the world. They know you are with me now. They cannot touch you without declaring war on the throne itself." "And what is my status in this arrangement?" she asked, the word protection tasting like ash in her mouth. "Am I a guest? A ward? Or a prisoner?" "You are an asset," he stated, the word cold and precise. "You are the key to unraveling this. The patterns you found. I need you to decipher them. You saw the rhythm of the machine. I believe you can see the meaning within it." He was not asking. He was telling her. Her function had changed. She was no longer a mechanic. She was a code breaker, a tool to be wielded in his private war. The anger she had suppressed now rose, cold and sharp. The passion from the hall felt like a distant, shameful dream. This was the reality. A man who saw people as functions, who saw her as a component to be used for his own ends. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice low but firm, "I am a citizen of this empire. I have rights under your own law. I have fulfilled my contract. You cannot compel me to serve you further without charge, without trial." She was challenging him. Here, in the heart of his power, a woman with nothing was citing his own laws against him. It was a foolish, dangerous move, and she knew it. But the alternative, to simply acquiesce, to become the pliant tool he expected, was a kind of death in itself. Cedric did not grow angry. His expression did not change. He simply watched her, his frosty eyes seeming to see the very architecture of her thoughts. "Law," he said, the word tasting like a foreign concept on his tongue. "The law is a framework for order, Mistress Thorn. It is a tool to ensure the stability of the whole. When that stability is threatened, the law must serve its primary purpose. And I am the ultimate arbiter of that purpose." He took the final step, closing the space between them. She had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his gaze. The sheer force of his presence was immense, a physical weight in the air. She could smell the faint, clean scent of soap and wool, the scent of the man beneath the Emperor. "You speak of rights," he continued, his voice a low murmur that was for her alone. "Let me speak of realities. The reality is that you are in this room because I willed it. The reality is that you are alive because I willed it. Your rights exist because my empire is stable enough to permit them. If that stability fails, your rights will evaporate like morning mist." He raised a hand, not to touch her, but to gesture at the maps behind him. "Out there is a network of vipers who would see this empire burn to serve their own ambitions. I will stop them. I will use any tool necessary to do so. You are, at this moment, the sharpest tool I possess." His gaze dropped from her eyes to her mouth just for a second and then returned. In that fleeting moment, the air crackled. The impersonal discussion of power and law was suddenly, terrifyingly intimate. The memory of the fire in her veins returned, a dull, insistent throb. He was a tyrant, a manipulator, a man who saw her as an object. "And yet, I am not a tool," she whispered, the words a desperate reassertion of her own soul. "No?" His voice was softer now, a dangerous, silken thread. "Then what are you, Alira Thorn? You are a woman who could have protested in that hall. You could have demanded your rights before the entire court. You had the law, the procedure, the argument. You had the will." The Emperor's words hung in the severe air of his study, not as a request, but as a statement of incontrovertible fact. You will decipher their intent. He had dismissed her rights, her personhood, as one might sweep aside a minor calculation that cluttered a larger equation. Elira stood frozen, a statue of disbelief. Her mind, a finely tuned chronometer of logic and process, had seized. Every gear of reason, every lever of protest was jammed by a force it could not measure. The preternatural stillness of the man before her, and the traitorous, resonant hum of her own blood. Object, formally. Cite the Imperial Code, Section 4, Paragraph 3. The rights of a free citizen under contract. The thought was a perfectly formed crystal of legal precedent in her mind, yet it shattered before it could reach her lips. The words died in her throat, strangled by the sheer gravitational pull of his presence. He was the law. The code was merely a description of his will, not a constraint upon it. This realization landed not as a thought, but as a physical blow, leaving her breathless. Emperor Cedric moved for the first time since she had entered, a fluid and deliberate motion that seemed to consume the very light in the room. He rounded his desk, the heavy wool of his tunic making no sound, and stopped before a wall dominated by a vast, unrolled map of the Empire's northern territories. His focus was absolute, his profile carved from stone. He did not look at her, yet she felt his attention on her like a physical weight. "The data you isolated," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. He gestured to a small, polished obsidian table where a stack of vellum scrolls lay bound in black cord. "Bring it." It was a command, simple and direct. For a heartbeat, she considered defiance. To remain immobile, to force him to acknowledge her as something more than a functionary to be ordered about. But her body betrayed her. Her legs, moving with an unnerving autonomy, carried her to the table. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the cord before lifting the top scroll. The vellum was cool and smooth, its surface covered in her own precise, angular script, the temporal anomalies logged from the orary's escapement mechanism. She approached his back, the scent of old paper and beeswax from the polished shelves filling her senses. She was a sparrow approaching a hawk, every instinct screaming of the danger in proximity. She held out the scroll. He did not turn. "Read the sequence for the 7th day, 4th cycle." Her eyes scanned the familiar notations. A lag of 312 milliseconds, followed by a gain of 156, then another lag of 312. She paused. "It repeats a prime number pattern, Your Majesty, interspersed with null values. It's a code, not a mechanical flaw." Her own voice sounded distant, a recording played back from another room. "I am aware," he said, his tone devoid of inflection. "The flaw is not in the machine, but in the men who presume to use my instruments against me. They believe their pattern is a whisper lost in the noise of the cosmos. You were the first to hear it." He finally turned, his eyes the color of winter frost, pinning her in place. He was closer than she had anticipated. The air grew thick, charged. "You are a component of singular quiet talent, Elira Thorne. It would be an inefficient use of resources to allow you to be discarded." A component. The word was a shard of ice in her gut. He did not see a person, a mind, a life with its own trajectory. He saw a tool, a specialized part for a vast, impersonal machine. And the most galling part, the part that felt like a crack forming in the very foundation of her soul, was that some broken piece of her rejoiced in the assessment. To be seen by him, even as an object, was to be given a terrifying, undeniable purpose. The passion that had seized her in the throne room was not a fleeting anomaly. It was a baseline resonance, a deep and horrifying hum that answered the call of his power. "The Lord Marshal has prepared quarters for you in the Spire of Solitude," the Emperor continued, his gaze sweeping over her as if taking an inventory. "You will have access to the Imperial archives, any celestial charts you require, and a direct line to my strategists. You will work there. You will not leave. A cage of exquisite comfort, a prison with a library." The freedom of anonymity she had cherished was gone, replaced by the gilded chains of Imperial notice. "And my own work?" she managed, the question thin and reedy. "My commission in the southern provinces is a matter of profound insignificance," he stated, turning back to his map. He picked up a silver stylus, its tip hovering over the city of Eridor. "There is a conspiracy, Chronographer Thorne. A network of powerful houses that believes the Empire is a mechanism they can recalibrate to their own benefit. They are fools, but they are dangerous fools. They use the orrery to coordinate a grain blight in the West Reach and to orchestrate the assassination of my Master of Coin. They are planning something more, something that requires the precise timing only the Grand Orrery can provide. You will find out what it is." He had given her the context, but it was not a gesture of inclusion. It was the briefing one gives a soldier before a battle, a litany of facts necessary for the completion of a task. The fate of the empire, the lives of millions, rested on a series of minute temporal lags she had almost dismissed as cosmic static. The scale of it was overwhelming, a weight that threatened to crush her. "You are under my protection today," he said again, the words echoing his public proclamation. But here, in the cold intimacy of his study, they held their true meaning. It was not a shield, it was a leash. He was not protecting her from them. He was preserving her for him. She was the sharpest tool he possessed to dismantle this threat, and he would keep it locked away until its work was done. A sharp rap on the heavy oak door broke the spell. "Enter," the Emperor commanded without turning. The Lord Marshal, a man whose face was a roadmap of bureaucratic fatigue and martial discipline, stepped inside. His eyes flicked to Elira for a fraction of a second, his expression a mask of professional indifference, before settling on the Emperor's back. "Your Majesty." "The rooms are secured." "Excellent," Kadric murmured, his stylus finally touching the map, leaving a faint scratch over a mountain pass. "Escort the chronographer. See that she has everything she needs." He spoke of her as if she were no longer in the room. The audience was over. The Lord Marshal gave a stiff, formal bow. "This way, mistress." Elira's feet felt leaden. She wanted to say something, a protest, a plea, a demand, but the Emperor's utter dismissal of her had stolen the air from her lungs. He remained at his map, a central sun around which all other bodies were forced to orbit. His attention already moved on to the next calculation in his grand Imperial equation. She was a problem solved, a tool acquired. She turned and followed the Lord Marshal out of the study. The heavy door closed behind them with a soft, definitive click, sealing her away from the center of power. The corridor beyond was a river of silent flowing courtiers and guards who parted before the Lord Marshal like water around a stone. The air here was warmer, thicker, cloying with the perfume of 100 different noble houses and the beeswax polish on the marble floors. It was the scent of intrigue, of desperation, of a world she had spent her entire life avoiding. The walk was long and silent. They ascended a spiral staircase, the tapestries on the walls depicting ancient battles and stoic-faced emperors of a bygone age. They were all ancestors of the man in the study, a lineage of absolute control. The Lord Marshal stopped before a pair of tall, inlaid doors at the end of a private hall, flanked by 2 guards in the silver and obsidian livery of the Emperor's personal shield. They stood as still as statues, their faces hidden behind visored helms. One of the guards pulled open the door, revealing a suite of rooms that made her small workshop apartment seem like a pauper's hovel. A sitting room was furnished with couches of deep blue velvet and tables of pale carved ashwood. Beyond it, a bedroom was visible, dominated by a vast bed draped in silk. To the side, another door stood open to a study, complete with an empty desk, shelves, and a large, south-facing window that looked out over the capital city. It was beautiful. It was sterile. It was a cage. "Your meals will be brought to you," the Lord Marshal said, his voice flat. "A list of your requirements for the work is to be given to the guards. It will be provided." He did not step inside. Elira walked into the center of the sitting room, the scrolls still clutched in her hand. The silence here was different from the charged silence of the Emperor's study. This was an empty, hollow silence, the silence of isolation. She turned back to the doorway. The Lord Marshal gave her a final, unreadable look. Then he nodded to the guard. The door swung shut. The sound of the heavy iron bolts sliding home was stark and final. It was the sound of her old life ending. She stood alone in the suffocating luxury of her prison, the fate of an empire condensed into the cryptic notations on the vellum in her hand. Passion had not let her leave the throne room, but it was the cold, unyielding mechanics of power that had locked her in. The heavy, oiled bolt of the lock sliding home was a sound of absolute finality. It was not the clean, metallic click of an escapement mechanism finding its place, but a thick, guttural thud. The sound of a door not merely closed, but sealed. For a long moment, Elira Thorne did not move. She stood in the center of the opulent chamber, a ghost in a machine of silk and polished mahogany, and listened to the silence that rushed in to fill the void left by the guard's retreating footsteps. Her mind, usually a well-ordered gallery of gears and levers, was a ruin. Thoughts lay scattered like shattered cogs. Prisoner. The word was a foreign object, sharp and indigestible. She who had built a life on the freedom of anonymity and the elegant liberty of logic was now a captive, not in a dungeon, but in a cage of exquisite comfort, which was somehow a more profound violation. The wealth of the room was an insult, a gilded mockery of the autonomy it had replaced. She forced herself to move, her steps unnaturally loud on the intricate parquet floor. She ran a hand over the cool, smooth surface of a writing desk carved from a single piece of heartwood, its grain a swirling nebula. She touched the spine of a leather-bound book that had never been opened, felt the impossibly soft nap of a velvet settee. Each sensation was a fresh indictment of her circumstances. This was not a room for living. It was a display. And she was the centerpiece, the newly acquired, priceless, and utterly powerless artifact. A wave of heat, sharp and sickening, washed through her, the phantom tide of her earlier humiliation. Passion would not let her leave. The memory was a brand on her consciousness. It was not the Emperor's declaration that haunted her, but the treacherous response of her own body. The sudden, shocking dissolution of her will, the current that had seized her, rendering her mute and compliant before his unnerving stillness. She had stood before the central sun of the empire and, instead of being incinerated, had found herself trapped in its orbit, her own volition a forgotten concept. Analyze it. The logical part of her mind commanded, a desperate reassertion of control. It was a physiological response to a threat, the paralysis of a lesser creature before a predator. Nothing more, but the explanation felt thin, a flimsy schematic for a cataclysm. It did not account for the strange, resonant hum that had vibrated through her, the terrifying sense of rightness in the face of absolute wrong. It was a paradox her mechanical worldview could not contain, and the cognitive dissonance was galling. She was a component, a tool. His words echoed in the palatial quiet. He had assessed her, identified her function, and installed her into his own grand political machinery. The thought should have been merely infuriating. Instead, a sliver of something else, a cold, terrifying flicker of pride, wormed its way through her anger. To be considered the sharpest tool by a man like Cadric. Elira recoiled from the thought as if from a hot iron. She stalked to the tall, arched window. The glass was thick, distorting the world outside into a painterly smear of twilight. Below lay a manicured garden, a perfect, sterile geometry of hedges and gravel paths. There were no people, no life, just a silent, ordered world that mirrored the cold precision of the man who ruled it. She pressed her fingertips to the unyielding pane, a sparrow testing the bars of an aviary built for eagles. Hours passed. The sky outside the window bled from indigo to the star-dusted black of true night. Elira did not light the lamps. She sat in the deepening gloom, a statue in the dark, letting the cold fury of her intellect slowly piece itself back together. She would not be a passive component. She would not be a decorative prisoner. If he wanted a tool, he would get one with edges sharp enough to cut its handler. She began to map the architecture of her new prison, not the physical room, but the political and logical one. She listed his motives, her potential value, the nature of the threat. The conspiracy was the lock. She was the key. But a key could also be used to understand the lock's design, to find its weaknesses. Just as she was beginning to feel the first fragile return of her own agency, a quiet knock fell upon the door. It was not the heavy-fisted summons of a guard, but something softer, more discreet. Elira's entire body went rigid. Him? The thought was immediate, involuntary. The door swung inward without a sound. Two palace servants, their faces blank and impassive as porcelain masks, entered the room. One carried a silver tray laden with covered dishes, a silent offering of food she had no desire to eat. The other, the one who held Elira's attention, carried a heavy, lead-lined coffer. They moved with an unnerving grace, their feet making no sound. They placed the food on a side table and the coffer upon the great writing desk. Then, with synchronized, prescribed curtsies, they backed out of the room, and the bolts slid home once more. For a long time, Elira only stared at the box. It sat on the desk like a dark, dense star, its presence warping the space around it. It was the manifestation of her new purpose. Finally, she rose and approached it. The lid was heavy, requiring both hands to lift. Inside, there was no velvet lining, only the dull gray of lead, her tools. But not the familiar loops, calipers, and drivers of her trade. Here were celestial charts of breathtaking detail, star maps so precise they must have been Imperial secrets. There were stacks of vellum covered in dense columns of numbers, intercepted communiques, she realized, coded as astronomical observations. And beneath it all, a set of master schematics for the grand orrery itself, rendered on linen paper so fine it was nearly translucent. They were copies of her own drafts, but annotated in the margins with a sharp, angular script she did not recognize. She lifted the top schematic, her fingers tracing the familiar lines of the Saturnian gear train. This was her world. This was a language she understood. The anger and humiliation of the day receded, replaced by the instinctual focus of the artisan. Her mind, so recently a chaotic mess, began to align, to click into place. She spread the documents across the vast expanse of the desk, the papers a constellation of data points on the dark wood. The Emperor wanted her to find a pattern in the noise. He believed a conspiracy was hiding its plans in the subtle language of planetary motion, using the orrery's own complex cycles as a cryptographic key. It was audacious. It was brilliant. It was, to her clockmaker's soul, a problem of irresistible elegance. Her eyes scanned the columns of figures, the timings, the angular velocities. The annotations in the margins were not corrections, she saw now, but queries. They highlighted specific moments, tiny deviations from the orary's otherwise perfect predictive model. Discrepancy at vernal equinox, year of the crimson comet. Why? Another note read, next to a complex equation governing Jupiter's orbital resonance, the year of the crimson comet. That was 3 years ago, the year the Lord Marshal of the Northern Armies had died in his sleep, his heart simply stopping. The official cause was fatigue. Elira pulled a celestial chart from the pile, her movements becoming quick, decisive. She cross-referenced the date with the star map. The intercepted observation for that night was a string of numbers detailing the position of a minor moon of Jupiter. It was gibberish, unless it wasn't an observation, unless it was an instruction. Her breath caught. With trembling fingers, she took the numbers from the communique and began applying them not to the chart of the heavens, but to the schematic of the orrery. She treated them as a sequence of inputs, micrometer adjustments to the escapement, minute changes in gear ratios. It was the work of a madman, intentionally introducing error into a perfect system. But as she translated the final number, she saw it. It was not chaos. It was a message. The sequence of tiny induced errors, when mapped onto the orary's own mechanism, created a new, hidden rhythm within the machine, a ghost frequency. It was a code of sublime complexity, a whisper hidden within the resonant hum of the empire. And on the night the Lord Marshal died, the ghost frequency had spiked to a precise, calculated peak. Elira leaned back in her chair, the papers spread before her like the entrails of some strange beast. A cold dread, far more profound than the fear of her own captivity, settled over her. This was not just a code, it was a weapon. And she, Elira Thorne, a simple chronographer from the provinces, was the only person in the world who knew how to read it. The Emperor had not just given her a puzzle, he had handed her the design for the dagger at his empire's throat. The realization did not arrive as a thought, but as a physical blow. The air punched from Elira's lungs, leaving a hollow ache in its place. Her fingers, resting on the schematics, grew numb, the chill of the vellum seeping into her skin like the onset of frostbite. The grand orrery, her orrery. The magnificent, intricate heart of the empire, a monument to reason and celestial order, was a weapon. The truth of it settled over her, not with the crisp clarity of a solved equation, but with the suffocating weight of a shroud. The work of her hands, the elegant dance of gears and counterweights she had so lovingly restored, was tainted. The resonant hum she had always found so comforting now echoed in her memory as a death knell. She leaned back in her chair, the plush velvet a mockery of comfort. Her gaze drifted from the schematics to the gilded ceiling of her suite, a cage of exquisite comfort, the Emperor had called it. He had not been speaking in metaphor. He had locked her in with a monster of her own understanding. How? The question was a lifeline, a purely mechanical problem to which her mind could cling. Her eyes snapped back to her notes. The ghost frequency was the key. A specific, sustained vibration, almost undetectable beneath the orary's primary operational resonance. She had dismissed it as harmonic noise, an artifact of wear. but it was targeted, intentional. Her mind, a well-oiled machine itself, began to cycle through possibilities. Sympathetic resonance, a specific, sustained frequency tuned to the crystalline structure of a particular material, vibrating it until it shattered. A tuning fork that could shatter glass from across a room. Only here, the room was the capital city, and the glass. The glass was a man's bones, or the delicate vessels of his brain, or perhaps it was more subtle. A frequency that interfered with the minute electrical impulses of the human heart, inducing fibrillation from a distance. It was monstrous, it was brilliant, and it was a perversion of every principle her craft was built upon. The late Lord Marshal Voronov, the official report had cited a sudden, catastrophic cerebral hemorrhage. An act of God, the court physicians had declared. Elira traced the date of the transmission again. It aligned perfectly. This was no act of God. It was an act of physics, delivered with the cold, impersonal precision of an assassin's blade. A wave of nausea rolled through her. She had spent 17 days with her hands on the murder weapon, tuning it to perfection. The silence of the suite pressed in. For hours, she worked, driven by a cold fury. She cross-referenced every flicker of anomalous data she had logged during her recalibration, every minute deviation. A pattern began to emerge, a constellation of phantom signals, each one a whisper of death. She was no longer a chronographer. She was an archaeologist of murder, excavating the digital ghosts of the Empire's dead. A sharp rap on the door made her flinch so violently that a stylus clattered to the floor. Before she could answer, the door swung inward. 2 Imperial guards, their black and silver armor absorbing the light, stepped into the room and took up positions on either side of the entrance. They were statues of polished steel and implicit threat. Then he entered. Emperor Kadric moved with a preternatural stillness that was more commanding than any grand gesture. The opulent room seemed to shrink around him, its gilded details turning tawdry in the face of his severe presence. He wore simple, dark tunics, devoid of the ornamentation favored by his court, yet power clung to him like a second skin. His eyes, the color of winter frost, found her immediately. They did not scan the room, they fixed upon their target. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of leather, ink, and the clean, cold ozone of his authority. "Report," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence, a blade honed on command. For a moment, words died in her throat. The analytical part of her mind, the part that had been racing through frequencies and resonance tables, stalled. It was replaced by a sudden, galling awareness of his proximity, of the sheer physical fact of him standing just 10 feet away. A wave of heat, entirely separate from the room's temperature, washed over her. "This is not logical," a frantic part of her mind insisted. "This is a weakness." She forced herself to her feet, her spine straightening with practiced discipline. She would not be a sparrow in his presence. She was a professional. She was Mistress Elira Thorne. "My lord," she began, her own voice sounding thin but steady. She gestured to the clutter of scrolls and vellum on the table. "I have cross-referenced the ghost frequency from the conspirator's message with my diagnostic logs from the recalibration." He walked toward the table, his steps silent on the thick carpet. He did not look at her, his attention focused entirely on her work. It was, she realized with a jolt, the same unnerving total focus he had given her in the audience hall. as if she, and now her work, were the only things in the universe that mattered. The frequency corresponds to a transmission sent 3 months ago, she continued, forcing herself to be clinical, to present the data as if it were a simple matter of misaligned gears. The timing coincides precisely with the death of Lord Marshal Voronov. Kadric stopped beside the table, his shadow falling across her schematics. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze sweeping over her frantic annotations. He was close enough now that she could feel the ambient coolness he seemed to generate. The official cause of death was natural, he stated, his voice a low murmur. It was not a question. The official cause was incorrect, Elira countered, her boldness surprising even herself. The orrery is not just a communications device. The conspirators are using it to generate targeted, sympathetic frequencies. They are using it as an assassination tool. She expected shock, alarm, perhaps even disbelief. The Emperor gave her none of them. He remained perfectly still for a long moment, his eyes tracing the lines of a complex equation she had scrawled in the margins. The silence stretched, thin and taut. When he finally looked up, his gaze met hers, and what she saw in its icy depths was not surprise, but a chilling flicker of confirmation, of intellectual satisfaction. "A more precise instrument than I had anticipated, Mistress Thorne," he said, the words a strange alloy of compliment and appraisal. "I suspected the orrery was the vector. I did not know the exact mechanism. You have provided it." The breath she had been holding escaped in a quiet, unsteady rush. He had known, or at least he had suspected. He had not sent her in blind. He had sent her in as a probe, a diagnostic tool to confirm his own hypothesis. The thought was both terrifying and, in a strange, perverse way, validating. He had not chosen her by chance. He had chosen her for her mind. "How is it focused?" he asked, his gaze dropping back to the charts. "The capital is vast. To kill one man would require a level of precision that seems improbable. Elira's own logic had already carried her there. It would require a focusing agent, a keystone. Something within the orrery's core mechanism, a piece of programmable crystalline material that can be tuned to a specific target resonance. And the target themselves." She trailed off, another piece clicking into place. The target would need a receiver, something on their person, a signet ring, a uniform pin, a piece of jewelry with a corresponding resonant matrix. The frequency would be harmless to anyone else. Kadric straightened, turning to face her fully. The Lord Marshal wore his signet ring day and night. It was buried with him. The implication hung in the air between them, cold and heavy as a block of granite. The conspiracy was not just outside the palace walls. It had access to the highest echelons of the Empire, close enough to gift or bestow these fatal tokens upon their targets. "Your task has changed, Mistress Thorne," the Emperor said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You are no longer merely deciphering their communications. You will find this keystone, you will learn its properties, its limitations. You will map every frequency they have ever used." He took a step closer, and her internal fortress of logic crumbled again under the sheer gravity of his presence. "You will teach me how to wield their weapon against them." He was not asking her to be a chronographer. He was asking her to be an armorer, a strategist, a participant. The passion that had seized her in the audience hall was not gone. It was merely banked, a low, dangerous heat in her veins that responded to the intensity in his eyes. It was the terrifying attraction of a moth to a flame that promised not warmth, but utter incineration. "I am a scientist," she whispered, the words a flimsy shield. "A mechanic? You are the sharpest tool I possess," he corrected her, his voice dropping lower, a resonant hum that vibrated through her. "And I will not have my tools dispute their function." He held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, a silent assertion of ownership, of absolute control. Then, without another word, he turned and swept from the room. The guards fell in behind him, and the door clicked shut, the sound unnervingly final. Elira stood frozen, her hand pressed to the table to steady herself. The air still vibrated with his presence. He had left her with an impossible command and a truth more terrifying than any discovery she had made. She was no longer a component in the vast impersonal machinery of the state. She was the linchpin. She was the escapement mechanism, the single, fragile piece upon which the entire machine now turned. And if she broke, the Empire might break with her. The Emperor's command hung in the severe air of the study, a weight as real and solid as the marble inlaid map on the table between them. Turn it against them. The words were not a request. They were a directive, an alteration of the fundamental laws of her world. Elira's mind, a place of precise gears and balanced equations, recoiled. The thought was abhorrent, a perversion of her craft's highest purpose. The orrery was a testament to cosmic harmony, a mechanical prayer to order. He was asking her to make it scream. "No," she said. The word was quiet, yet it seemed to absorb all the sound in the room. It was the most reckless thing she had ever done. Emperor Kadric did not so much as blink. His stillness was a physical force, a gravity well that pulled all attention toward him. "You will elaborate on that refusal, chronographer Thorn." She forced herself to breathe, to assemble her argument as she would a delicate escapement mechanism. This was not a plea. It was a statement of principle, the only shield she possessed. "Your Majesty, my work, the work of any chronographer, is the measurement and preservation of harmony. The grand orrery is the ultimate expression of that principle. It models the celestial dance. To use its resonance as a weapon, it is a desecration. It is to take an instrument of order and teach it to create chaos." Her own voice sounded thin and academic in the face of his absolute power. "Object. Formally. Cite the Imperial Code, Section Gamma, Article 12. The misuse of Imperial instruments." The thought was a useless flicker of defiance. The Emperor was the code. "The chaos already exists, Elira," he said, and the use of her given name was a subtle, unnerving shift in pressure. A broken gear grinds within the vast clockwork of the state. A dissonant frequency is already playing. You are not creating it. You are merely identifying its source. I am not asking you to compose a new score. I am asking you to read the one that is already written so that I might silence the orchestra. His logic was a blade, turning her own reasoning against her. He saw the orrery not as a sacred model, but as a system with a vulnerability. And a system, to him, was a thing to be controlled. "It is one thing to identify a flaw," she countered, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "It is another to become the architect of its use. I am a builder, a calibrator, not a weaponsmith." "You are whatever the Empire requires you to be," he stated, the words as cold and final as a death sentence. He saw the mutiny still simmering in her eyes, the rigid line of her jaw. For a long moment, he simply watched her, his gaze analytical, as if measuring the stress points in a failing component. Then he turned from her and walked to a tall, narrow cabinet of dark, polished wood. He produced a scroll case of worn leather, from which he extracted a length of fine parchment, its edges sealed in black wax. He laid it on the map table, the rasp of the parchment against the stone, a dry, ominous sound. He broke the seals with a flick of his thumb and unrolled it. "You speak of principles," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. "Let us speak of consequences." Elira's gaze was drawn downward against her will. The scroll was a list of names, written in a scribe's immaculate, impersonal hand. Beside each name was a title: Lord Marshal of the Western Marches, High Arbiter of the Imperial Judiciary, First Scrivener of the Archives. There were 24 of them, a constellation of the Empire's most powerful figures. At the top of the second column, a name was crossed out with a single, brutal line of crimson ink: Lord Admiral Valerius, the official whose death had been attributed to a sudden, catastrophic failure of the heart. "This is a list of targets," the Emperor said, his finger tracing a line in the air just above the parchment. "Intercepted from the same channel you discovered, the conspiracy's intended harvest." Elira felt a wave of icy dread wash through her, colder and more profound than her fear of him. This was not a theoretical political struggle. It was a methodical plan for slaughter. Her eyes scanned the names, each one a pillar of the Athelian state. Her discovery had not been an intellectual curiosity, it had been the key to a purge. Then she saw it, halfway down the first column. Master Arsenio, prefect of the Artificers Guild. The air left her lungs. Master Arsenio, the old man with hands stained by oil and flux, who had first tested her as an apprentice. He was the living repository of centuries of mechanical knowledge, a figure as foundational to her world as the law of gravity. He was brilliant, cantankerous, and utterly devoted to the purity of the craft. The idea of that sharp, ordered mind being extinguished by a wave of manufactured dissonance was a violation that cut deeper than any political calculus. It was an attack on knowledge itself, on her. "He is a craftsman," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "He has no part in this." "His part is his position," Kadric replied, his gaze unpitying. "He oversees the maintenance of every critical mechanism in the Citadel, the orrery included. To the conspirators, he is either an obstacle to be removed or a potential asset to be coerced. They have clearly decided on the former." He looked at her, his eyes locking onto hers. "They see him as I see you, a tool. They simply lack my appreciation for a tool's proper function." The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and heavy. The grand, abstract debate over principle had collapsed into this one. Terrible point. Master Arsenio's life was on a list, and she, Elira Thorne, was the only person in the Empire who understood the architecture of the killing blow aimed at him. Kadric moved, stepping around the table until he stood beside her. The heat of his presence was a physical shock, a disruptive current that scrambled the neat circuits of her thoughts. She was acutely aware of the fine wool of his tunic, the faint, clean scent of soap and vellum that clung to him, a stark contrast to the cloying perfumes of the court. He leaned over the map, his arm brushing against hers. A jolt, sharp and unnerving, shot through her. It was the resonance, that damnable, inexplicable passion that sparked to life only in his proximity. A treacherous warmth flooded her veins, a magnetic pull that defied every logical impulse screaming at her to step away. Her mind was a fortress under siege from without and betrayed from within. "Your theory," he said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. "The keystone and the receiver. Show me." His command was absolute, but his closeness was a form of persuasion all its own. He was not merely an emperor demanding obedience. He was the central sun of this terrifying new system, and his gravity was inescapable. Her principles were a distant, fading star. The threat to Arsenio was a burning meteor. And the emperor himself was the unnerving, undeniable force holding her in place. Passion would not let her leave. Duty would not let her refuse. Her hand, when she raised it, trembled. The protest died in her throat, replaced by a grim, sickening sense of inevitability. She was a component, and the machine had begun to move. She pointed to the schematic of the grand orrery, laid out beside the death list like a blueprint for a tomb. "The frequency is too broad," she began, her voice gaining a semblance of its usual precision as she retreated into the safety of her expertise. A wave of that power would cause sympathetic vibrations in every metallic object for leagues. It would be indiscriminate. To focus it on a single human target requires a secondary resonance, a focusing principle. Her finger traced a path to the very core of the orrery's diagram, to the central gyroscopic stabilizer she had spent days recalibrating. The keystone would have to be here. A modification to the primary escapement, something that modulates the main frequency with a secondary targeted signal. It would be almost impossible to detect without knowing what to look for. A ghost in the machine. Kadric listened, his focus total. He was no longer looking at her, but at the schematic, his mind absorbing the information, processing it. And the receiver? It would have to be something the target keeps on their person, Elira continued, the horror of it all crystallizing into cold, hard theory. Something metallic, something personal, an insignia of office, a signet ring, even a chronometer. She looked at the crimson line through Lord Admiral Valerius's name. The receiver would be tuned to the keystone's specific modulation. When the ghost frequency is broadcast, only the tuned receiver would achieve perfect resonance, amplifying the wave to a lethal degree. The victim's own body would become the final component of the weapon. A profound silence descended upon the study. She had done it. She had explained the mechanics of a perfect, untraceable murder. She had given him the knowledge he demanded. "Find it," Kadric said, his voice flat. He straightened up, and the warmth of his presence receded, leaving a sudden, noticeable chill in its wake. "Find the code for the keystone. Isolate the modulation sequence for each name on that list. Give me the ability to retune the receivers." He did not need to finish the sentence, "so that I may choose the target." He turned and walked toward the door, his purpose clear. He had what he needed from her, for now. At the threshold, he paused without looking back. "You are a builder, chronographer Thorn. You are correct. So build me a key." The lock is already on the door. The door closed with a quiet, definitive click, leaving her alone in the sudden vastness of the study. Elira stood frozen, her hand still hovering over the schematic. She stared at the intricate lines and gears, the elegant mathematics of the cosmos, but she no longer saw a model of celestial harmony. She saw the architecture of a weapon, and she was its new and unwilling smith. The vellum in her hand was a dead weight, a flimsy sheet of processed hide that held the gravity of a tombstone. Kalen's name was not written in the elegant looping script of the court scribes, but in a clipped, functional hand that made his existence seem like a line item on an auditor's ledger, an asset to be liquidated. The word, weaponize, still hung in the severe, book-scented air of the Emperor's study, a discordant note that shattered the room's intellectual stillness. Elira's mind, usually a seamless engine of logic and calculation, had seized. Its gears were jammed with the grit of an impossible command. Object, formally. Cite the Imperial Code, Section 4, Paragraph 7, the misappropriation of Imperial instruments. The thought was a useless flicker, a spark extinguished by the suffocating pressure of the man watching her. The Emperor was the code. The law was whatever he decreed it to be in this moment. "You believe it is a desecration," he said. It was not a question. His voice was calm, a placid surface over icy depths, and it stripped the argument from her before she could even form the words. She forced her gaze up from the list, meeting his. It was a mistake. His focus was absolute, a physical force that pinned her in place. That strange, galling resonance hummed in the space between them, a low thrum against her bones that was not sound, but something more fundamental. It was a sympathetic frequency of its own, one that bypassed her reason and spoke directly to some traitorous primal part of her. Passion, the word he had used, was too simple. This was a violation, an invasive energy that made her feel seen, known, and terrifyingly vulnerable. The grand orrery is an instrument of order, she managed, her voice thin but steady. It measures the celestial dance. It provides the rhythm by which the empire functions. It is a map of truth. To turn it into a tool for ending lives. The word murder died in her throat, too crude for this chamber, too raw for the cold precision of the act she was being asked to perform. The empire is also an instrument of order, Kadric countered, his tone unchanged. He took a single deliberate step closer. The air thickened. It, too, provides a rhythm. And sometimes that order must be maintained not by mapping truth, but by excising falsehood. You see a desecration. I see a surgical necessity. A cancer has taken root in the brass and iron heart of my government. Your report proves it. Are you suggesting I allow it to fester? His logic was a vice, tightening with each dispassionate sentence. He was reframing the unthinkable, polishing it into an act of statecraft, a grim necessity. He was making her a party to it, not by force of arms, but by force of reason, a twisted, perverted reflection of her own core principles. There are other ways, she insisted, clutching at the edges of the argument. The Lord Marshal, the Imperial Guard. You have armies, inquisitors. Who can I trust? He interrupted, the question sharp as shattered glass. The men on this list are not common traitors. They are marshals, ministers, chancellors. They are the very men I would send to hunt themselves. They have woven their conspiracy into the fabric of the state. To pull at one thread openly is to risk unraveling the whole tapestry. It would mean civil war. He gestured to the list in her hand. Their method is silent, precise, untraceable, an affliction of the heart, a sudden seizure, a tragedy. I will use their own weapon against them. You will teach me how. Her mind raced, seeking an escape route, a technicality. The theory is unproven. The keystone, the focusing element, It is purely hypothetical. I have no schematics, no precedent. It might not even be possible to control the frequency with the precision required. You could miss. You could hit the wrong target. You could hit hundreds of innocents. But you believe it exists, he stated, his eyes narrowing slightly. He saw the truth in her before she could hide it. Your report all but sketches its design. You know where to look. You know what to look for. You are a creature of systems, Elira Thorne. You see the ghost in the machine because you understand the machine's soul. You will find this keystone. The finality of his words left no room for debate. He was not asking for her opinion. He was outlining her function. She was no longer a chronographer, a scholar invited for her expertise. She was a component, a newly acquired tool he was calibrating for a terrible purpose. The name on the vellum seemed to burn through the parchment and into her skin. Kalen. Her mentor, the man who had first shown her the beauty in an escapement mechanism, who had taught her that the universe was a grand and elegant clockwork. He was a quiet, unassuming academic who believed in order above all else. He was a target. And the Emperor, this cold, calculating predator, knew it. He had not shown her the list as evidence. He had shown it to her as a leash. A wave of heat washed through her, a nauseating mix of fury and fear. He was using her love for her mentor as a fulcrum, her skill as a lever. It was masterful. It was monstrous. And beneath the horror, that other current still flowed, the unnerving magnetic pull. It was the fascination of watching a master predator at work, the terrifying awe of standing at the epicenter of absolute power. A part of her was repulsed, yet another, deeper part, was captivated. The realization was a self-inflicted wound, more painful than any threat he could make. Passion would not let her leave, but it was not the passion of romance. It was the horrifying passion of a moth for a flame, a destructive, inevitable attraction to the thing that would consume her. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the air tasting of dust and dominion. The gears of her mind began to turn again, no longer fighting the command, but analyzing it. It was a problem. A complex, horrifying problem with variables she could not control and a solution that would cost her a piece of her soul. But the logic of survival was brutal and absolute. Option A, refuse. Kalen dies. She is at best imprisoned for the rest of her life. At worst, she is eliminated as a liability. The conspiracy continues unchecked. Option B, comply. Kalen might live. The conspiracy is dismantled, albeit through horrific means. She becomes an architect of death. There was no option C. Her gaze dropped back to the list. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge. To find the keystone, she said, her voice a low, hollow thing, I will need the original architectural schematics for the grand orrery. All of them, including the rejected drafts from its initial commission. A flicker of something, not surprise, but acknowledgement, passed through the Emperor's eyes. He had presented the problem, and she had begun to solve it. She had capitulated. And I will need access to the Imperial archives, she continued, the words feeling like foreign objects in her mouth. Specifically, records from the orrery's construction and its subsequent modifications. All levels of clearance. It will be granted, Kadric said. He moved to his desk, his back to her for a moment. The pressure of his attention receded, and she could breathe again, though the air was no less heavy. He retrieved a small, unadorned signet ring of blackened iron from a drawer. This will serve as your warrant. There is no door in the citadel it will not open, no archivist who will deny you." He turned and held it out to her. She had to step forward to take it, closing the distance between them once more. As her fingers brushed his to take the ring, the resonance surged, a jolt of heat that was almost painful. It was like touching a live wire. Her breath hitched. His expression remained a mask of sovereign calm, but she could have sworn she saw a tightening at the corner of his eye, a momentary sharpening of his focus, as if he had felt it too. Or perhaps he was merely observing her reaction, cataloging it like any other piece of data. She pulled her hand back as if burned, the cold iron of the ring a stark contrast to the heat that had just passed between them. It was heavy in her palm, a key to every secret in the Empire, a shackle. "You will work from the chronographer's suite in the West Wing," he commanded, his voice returning to its default tone of dispassionate authority. "It has been prepared for you. It contains a workshop and a direct-line astrolabe connected to the orrery's primary sensors. You will report your progress to me, and only to me." Elira nodded, unable to speak. She slid the ring onto her finger. It felt alien. "You are under my protection," he said, repeating the words that had begun her captivity. But they sounded different now. They were no longer a statement of fact, but a reminder of the terms of her service. She was protected so that she could be used. She was his instrument now, as surely as the orrery would become hers. With a slight inclination of his head, he dismissed her. A guard materialized at the door as if summoned from the shadows. The audience was over. As she walked from the study, the long hall of the Sunstone Citadel seemed to stretch into an infinite gilded corridor. The exquisite comfort of her cage was gone, replaced by the cold reality of its purpose. She was not a guest, she was not a prisoner, she was something new, something she had no name for, a weapon being forged against her will. The intricate, predictable clockwork of her life had been smashed, and its pieces were being reassembled by an emperor's hand into a monstrous new configuration. And the most terrifying part was not the command, or the threat, or even the man who issued it. It was the quiet, treacherous hum inside her own blood, a resonance that whispered she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The Emperor's command did not echo in the severe, book-lined study. It landed with the dead finality of a closing vault door, a soundless concussion that seemed to draw all the air from Elira's lungs. "Teach me how to use it." The words were not an order so much as a recalibration of her entire existence. He was not asking her to repair a clockwork mechanism. He was commanding her to wind a weapon of mass assassination and place its key in his hand. The meticulous architecture of her mind, a place of comforting logic and predictable systems, fractured. For a dizzying second, she was no longer in the Emperor's study, but back in her workshop, surrounded by the scent of brass and oil, her hands steadying an escapement wheel. It was a world that made sense, a world where sympathetic resonance was a theoretical danger to be avoided, not a tool to be perfected. Object, a voice of pure reason screamed inside her, formally. Cite Imperial Code, Section 12, Article 4, the proscription against the use of esoteric sciences for martial purposes. This is illegal. This is monstrous. The words formed in her throat, a perfect, logical, and utterly useless protest. They died there, strangled by the cold reality of his gaze. His eyes, the color of winter frost, held no room for debate. They were the eyes of a man who did not ask, but defined. He had already recast her world and her role within it. She was no longer a chronographer. She was a weaponsmith. "I cannot," she managed, the words a thin, brittle thread in the profound stillness. It was the weakest sound she had ever made. Cedric did not so much as blink. He regarded her dissent with the detached curiosity of a master artisan examining a flawed component. "You mistake the nature of this conversation, Illyra Thorn," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the floorboards, through them the soles of her boots. "I am not soliciting your opinion on the morality of the act. The act is a necessity. The conspirators forged this sword. I am merely taking it from their hands before they can sever the spine of the Empire. I am asking for the operational manual." His logic was a cold, perfect equation, and she was merely a variable he was solving for. It was galling, infuriating, and terrifyingly effective. He used reason, her own trusted shield, as his sharpest weapon against her. "To do as you ask," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its former precision as she retreated to the familiar ground of technicality, "is to become a murderer. My work is to measure time, not to end it. Your work," he countered, taking a single deliberate step closer, "is to serve the stability of this empire, a function you have performed admirably until this moment. Do you believe your hands are clean? The orrery you so perfectly calibrated dictates the timing of harvests, the movement of legions, the collection of tithes. Your measure of time determines whether a province eats or starves, whether a border is defended or overrun. You have been ending and saving lives on a scale you cannot imagine since the first day you laid a hand on its gears. The only difference now is that you will be forced to look at the names." He stopped, standing so near that the heat of his body breached the cold bubble of her shock. The air grew thick, charged with an invisible current. It was the resonance, the damnable, inexplicable passion that flared in his proximity. It was not a soft, melting warmth, but a sharp, high-frequency hum, a sympathetic vibration between them that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. In this moment of utter opposition, of moral revulsion, it was stronger than ever. It felt like her very cells were aligning with his will, a profound and horrifying betrayal from within. Her body was a traitor to her mind. This is how he does it, she realized with a wave of icy dread. This power was not just his title or his guards. It was him, a force of nature that bent the world and its people to his shape. "They will not stop," Cedric continued, his voice dropping lower, becoming a conspiratorial murmur that was somehow more commanding than a shout. "They have tasted this power. They will use it to tear down everything. Your mentor, the Lord Marshal, the entire Council of Electors. They will turn the heart of the Empire into a graveyard, and they will do it silently, untraceably. Unless you teach me to strike first." His face, a roadmap of severe lines and calculated thoughts, was illuminated by the single oil lamp on his desk. There was no pleasure in it, no cruel satisfaction. There was only the stark, chilling pragmatism of a man who had weighed all outcomes and chosen the most efficient path, irrespective of its human cost. He saw a problem, and she was the tool for its solution. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. He had left her no room to maneuver, no logical ground on which to stand. Her principles were a luxury the Empire and her own survival could no longer afford. To refuse was to condemn her mentor, to allow the conspiracy to succeed, to surrender to chaos. To accept was to sacrifice the very essence of who she was. He had caged her, not with bars of iron, but with the bars of her own conscience. Her gaze fell from his face, landing on the star charts scattered across his desk. Constellations of ink on parchment, systems predictable and pure. She clung to the image, a drowning woman grasping for a spar of wood in a churning sea. Her mind, seeking any escape from the moral abyss, retreated to the only place it felt safe, the problem itself. The weapon is not the orrery, she heard herself say, the words detached as if spoken by another person. The orrery is merely the amplifier, the power source, the resonating chamber. The Emperor's stillness was absolute. He watched her, his focus total, recognizing the shift in her. He had broken her resistance and was now observing the component's realignment to its new purpose. The true weapon, she continued, her mind beginning to assemble the puzzle against her will, is what you called the keystone. A specific physical object placed within the orrery's core mechanism. It would have to be crafted from a material capable of holding and focusing the ghost frequencies. Something that can be tuned to a specific target's biological signature. She looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his. The passion, the resonance was still there, a low thrum beneath the surface of her horror. It was a chain binding her to him as surely as any manacle. I cannot teach you how to use a weapon I cannot find. Its design, its material, its placement, it is all theoretical. To weaponize the orrery, we must first find the keystone. A flicker of something, not triumph, but a deep, chilling satisfaction passed through his eyes. He had her. She had not agreed, not verbally, but she had engaged with the problem. Her analytical mind, once set upon a puzzle, could not abandon it. He had known it would be so. "Then you will find it," Kadric stated. It was a simple, flat declaration of fact. He stepped back, breaking the suffocating proximity, and the air rushed back into the space between them, cold and thin. He moved to his desk, becoming once more the remote, calculating center of the Empire. You will have unrestricted access to the orrery. You will have access to the Imperial archives, the geological surveys, the metallurgic treatises. You will have whatever you require. He paused, picking up the kill list from his desk, the parchment a death sentence in his hands. He did not look at it. He looked only at her. "Your protection is contingent upon your utility, chronographer," he said, the words as precise and cold as the mechanism she was now being forced to build. "Find the keystone. Teach me its song. That is your work now." Elira stood frozen in the center of the room, the scent of old paper and beeswax filling her senses. The roaring protest in her soul had subsided into a terrible, silent acquiescence. She was under his protection. She was his prisoner. She was his weaponsmith. The distinctions had ceased to matter. There was only the work, a monstrous, intricate problem that her own mind had already begun to solve. The words, once spoken, could not be unsaid. "I will do it." They hung in the severe air of the study, a vow extracted under duress, a capitulation that felt like the snapping of a vital internal component. Elira felt the immediate aftermath not as relief, but as a profound and hollow emptiness. Her principles, once a fortress of granite, had become sand, washed away by the tide of his implacable will. Emperor Kadric did not smile. He did not offer words of praise or triumph. Such displays were for lesser men who savored the petty victories of negotiation. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if she had merely confirmed an entry in a ledger, a variable now accounted for. The motion was more galling than any gloating could have been. It communicated with absolute clarity that her consent had never been a matter of question, only of time. "Good," he said, the word as clipped and final as the closing of a vault. He turned from her, his back a rigid line of authority, and moved toward the massive oak desk that dominated the room. "The work begins at once. The conspirators will not remain idle." The sheer pragmatism of his shift was a dousing of ice water. He had broken her, and now he expected her to function. A part of her, the part that was still screaming in silent logical protest, wanted to refuse, to claw back that fatal concession. But the image of her mentor's name on that list was a brand on her mind. The choice had been an illusion. There was never a choice at all. Forcing the tremor from her limbs, Elira drew on the only armor she had left, her craft. She straightened her spine, channeling the cold precision of a chronographer facing a complex mechanism. "To do this," she began, her voice strained but steady, "I will have requirements." He paused in the act of unrolling a scroll, his gaze lifting to meet hers across the expanse of the room. That unnerving stillness settled over him again, the attention of a predator that has cornered its prey and is now merely observing its behavior. "State them. First, I require every schematic for the Grand Orrery. Not just the originals, but every modification, every repair, every supplemental system added since its initial construction. I need to see its history, its evolution. It will be done. Second, all maintenance and access logs for the past 5 years. Every technician, every artisan, every cleaner who has entered the chamber. I need to know who had the opportunity to physically alter the mechanism. They will be delivered to you." The ease of his agreement was a fine wire of tension. He was giving her precisely what she asked for, yet each acquiescence felt like the tightening of a leash. She took a breath, marshalling her thoughts for the most critical piece. "Third, I must return to the orrery chamber. Schematics are not enough. This weapon? It is integrated into the very structure of the machine. I cannot dissect it from a distance." For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his features. Not refusal, but a deep, analytical consideration. He gestured to a high-backed chair before the desk, an invitation that was unmistakably a command. "Sit. Explain." Her legs felt unsteady as she crossed the rug, the woven patterns a dizzying map of Imperial conquests. She sat on the edge of the hard leather, refusing to lean back, refusing to accept the comfort of her cage. She looked at the desk, cluttered not with ornament, but with the tools of rule: star charts, troop deployment maps, stacks of sealed documents. "The sympathetic frequency you described," she began, her mind retreating to the familiar territory of physics and mechanics, "to generate a resonance powerful enough to cause cellular decohesion from across the city. It cannot be broadcast like a signal from a tower. The energy would dissipate. It must be focused, sharpened to a single point." She picked up a stylus from his desk, the silver cool against her skin, and found a blank corner on a piece of discarded parchment. Without thinking, she began to sketch. A series of concentric circles for the orrery's rings, a point for the target. The conspirators are not simply using the orrery's resonant hum, she explained, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke of her own discipline. They have turned the entire mechanism into a focusing array, like a lens for sound. But a lens of this complexity requires a heart. A specific physical object placed within the orrery's core to generate and tune the initial frequency. She drew a small dark shape at the center of her diagram. A keystone. Kedrick leaned forward, his focus absolute. He did not look at her sketch, but at her face, his winterfrost eyes searching for the truth of her theory in her own expression. This keystone, what is it? I cannot be certain without examining the orrery. It would need to be a material with unique resonant properties, a crystalline structure perhaps, or a rare metallic alloy, something that can be tuned to a specific biological signature. It is not enough to ring the bell, Your Majesty, she said, the metaphor coming to her unbidden. You need the clapper. This keystone is the clapper, and it has been shaped to strike a chord that only a specific human life can hear. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. He was so close now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the faint, clean scent of ozone and old paper that clung to him. It was the scent of power, of sleepless nights spent governing a world. That strange, traitorous current sparked deep within her, a low hum that vibrated in time with the silent thrum of the citadel itself. It was a terrifying, magnetic pull, a resonance far more dangerous than the one she was tasked to understand. Her hand, holding the stylus, began to tremble. With a deliberate motion, she set the stylus down, placing her hands in her lap to still them. He is a force of nature, she told herself, a mantra of cold logic. You are a component, nothing more. Find this keystone, Kedrick said, his voice a low command that brooked no argument. He pushed back from the desk, the scrape of his chair unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Isolate it, learn its function. Then you will teach me how to retune it. The boldness of the order chilled her more than any threat. He did not ask if it was possible. He did not question her theory. He had absorbed her knowledge and converted it into a directive. She was no longer a diagnostician. She was an instructor in the art of assassination. My access to the orrery chamber must be absolute and solitary, she insisted, one final attempt to carve out a space for herself. I cannot work with guards observing my every move. You will have your solitude within the chamber, he conceded, but you will not be without protection or oversight. He walked to the door and opened it. A man stood waiting in the hall. Lord Marshal Valerius, his face a roadmap of bureaucratic fatigue, his uniform immaculate. The Lord Marshal will see you accommodated. Valerius bowed, his eyes avoiding Elira's. Your Majesty, the chronographer is to be given the Azure Suite, adjoining the archives, the Emperor commanded. She is to have access to any document she requisitions. She will be escorted to and from the Grand Orrery as she requires. No one is to enter her rooms or the orrery chamber while she is working. Outside of those spaces, she is not to be left alone. She is my guest, Valerius. See that she is treated with all the solicitude that station implies. The word hung in the air, weighted with unspoken meaning. Solicitude, protection, imprisonment, they were all the same. Valerius nodded. It will be as you command. Kedrick's gaze fell upon Illyra one last time. There was no warmth in it, no empathy, There was only the stark, possessive assessment of a monarch inspecting his newest, sharpest tool. You wished for your anonymity, Illyrathorn. I have granted it. To the world, you have vanished. You exist now only for the Empire, only for me. He stepped back into the study, and the heavy door closed with a soft final click, sealing her out. The Lord Marshal gestured down the grand corridor. "This way, Master Thorn." She followed him in silence, two stoic guards falling into step behind her. They walked through halls of impossible scale, past tapestries depicting ancient battles and alcoves holding the busts of long-dead emperors. It was a journey from the brain of the Empire to the heart of her new cage. The Azure Suite was aptly named. The walls were hung with silks the color of a twilight sky. The furniture was carved from pale, fragrant wood and upholstered in velvet. A fire was already laid in the hearth, its gentle crackle the only sound. It was a room of exquisite comfort, more luxurious than any place she had ever slept. It was also utterly sterile, lacking a single personal touch, a single sign of life. The Lord Marshal paused at the door. "A servant will bring you food. Should you require anything, you need only inform the guards outside." He did not wait for a response before turning and departing, his footsteps receding down the hall. The door closed. This time she heard the distinct, metallic sound of a lock sliding into place. Elira stood alone in the center of the vast, silent room. She looked at her hands, the hands of a craftsman, a builder, a woman who brought order to the universe's celestial dance. Now they would be put to work dismantling a life's work to fashion a weapon. She had traded her freedom and her soul for the life of one man, and in doing so had been bound into the service of another. The passion he ignited in her was a phantom limb, an ache for a connection she could not afford and did not want. But the cold reality of the locked door was absolute. She was under his protection, and she would not be allowed to leave.